In order to understand and describe how the overall economy works, it's very important to get a measure of how big it is and how it changes over time. Brings us to the subject of national income and product accounting, how to measure total GDP in the economy. In this talk, we want to consider the elements of national income and product accounting. We have talked about different ways to measure GDP, the total gross domestic product in a country. For example, the spending approach, which we described earlier, measures GDP by asking how much people spend. And you can think about there's consumption spending, C, there's investment spending, I, there's net exports, which is the difference between export spending and imports, and finally there's government purchases. So we noted that one could get an estimate of the total production of goods and services in a country in a particular period of time by adding up what people spend. There's two other ways to measure GDP, which we want to consider now. And both of these are intended to get another measure of production, which is what GDP is. But they give additional insights and moreover are a way to check whether the spending approach is working at any particular point in time. So let's first consider the income approach and then the production approach. It's important to recognize that there's a basic microeconomic reasoning behind the income approach. It comes from just considering example of a firm. A firm's profits, you recall, the difference between its revenues and its costs. We can think of revenues as the price of the quantity produced times the number of items produced, the quantity itself. That's just production evaluated at market prices. And we know that's what GDP should be if you sum up for all the production in the economy as a whole. Market prices times quantity. Of course, that means that the market production, price times quantity, is equal to cost plus profits. You just put costs on the other side of the equation, and you can see that there's a profits definition, which is quite clear. The costs we've always emphasized are what the firm has to pay to produce the product, so that would consider wages to pay to the workers, and that includes fringe benefits as well as the hourly wage or the monthly wage. Rents must pay to the buildings it's using, the office buildings or the factories or the trucks. Interest on loans that it might use to buy that equipment. And finally, profits itself, which is the fourth item in this list. Economists like to lump these together, the wages in particular, into labor income. Obviously, it's the income of workers they get for the labor. And then the rest, rents plus interest plus profits, are frequently called capital income. It's really the payments to capital, whether you're renting a truck or paying interest on a loan to the bank to buy the truck, or the actual profits that are earned by the firm. So this is pretty clear that if we add up what everyone earns, add up the total of that, we get another measure of GDP. So GDP, the total production in the economy, again, price times quantity, that's the production market prices, can be obtained and determined simply by adding up all the income that's obtained by labor through working and all the income that goes to capital. That's the concept, and you can see it comes just from the basic economics. Well, let's consider an example, and let's focus on the second quarter of 2013, to be very specific. The data in the table, which we'll examine in the next few minutes, are obtained from the statistical agencies that are in charge of collecting these data. That's mainly the Bureau of Economic Analysis, located in Washington, D.C. And so they collect data like this. They have a very complex series of accounts, and it's called the National Income and Product Accounts, is what they put together. And again, the income, because you can obtain it by summing up income as we're doing now, but also because the emphasis is on total product in the economy. So let's get started with this. Income is the sum of the items in the table. So for example, labor income, that's all the wages and salaries and fringe benefits paid to workers in the second quarter of 2013, was $8.811 trillion, or $8,811 billion. You can see the units are in the lower left-hand part of this table. And there's also a reminder that these data are seasonally adjusted. We've discussed that before. It's basically smoothing out the seasons in the economy. Spending might be higher in the Christmas season or any holiday season, for example. And then they are stated at an annual rate, just as we considered GDP before. So that's labor income. Capital income, the second item, is 4.461 trillion, or 4,461 billion. Depreciation is an item which we also have to include, and it's important to think about this. Capital equipment, the trucks or the buildings, depreciate over time. They become less valuable over time, and they have to be replaced when they wear out. When we think about the income that a firm earns, that wear out is really taken away from the income. But the replacement of that worn out capital is part of the production of the economy. You have to produce a new truck to replace a truck that gets trashed or scrapped. So you want to add in this depreciation because we're interested in a measure of production. We're getting it from the income side, but since firms don't report that depreciation as part of their income, we have to add it back in because they have to produce the new trucks that are built to replace the old trucks. Depreciation is a big number, $2,632 billion in the U.S. economy. Next, we have to make an adjustment, though, because the firms pay taxes to the government, and the taxes are not included in its income or its profits, but it's had to represent production. The firm had to produce and sell products in order to get the money to pay the taxes. So since we're looking at a measure of production, we want to add back in the taxes that the firm paid to the government. On the other side, the firm gets some subsidies from the government, but that subsidies does not represent any particular production, so we want to subtract that out. And it's similar with transfers. Firms sometimes make charitable donations, and that doesn't represent production, so we have to adjust for transfers as well. When we add up all that stuff together, we get 1.167 trillion, 1,167 billion. The final adjustment that has to be made must take account of the fact that some people are working in the United States, but they may be foreigners. For example, a Canadian hockey player playing for the Pittsburgh Penguins is producing services in the United States, the pleasure of going to watch that hockey game, but being a Canadian, the income is actually attributed to that person. So we basically have to add back in that income in order to get a measure of production in the United States. Similarly, there may be an athlete who's an American, maybe playing basketball in Europe, and that person's basically getting income, but it represents production of basketball services in Europe. So we have to bring these two things into account. We have to add back in the income of foreigners for production in the United States. In this example, it's $570 billion in 2013 second quarter. And then the other side of the coin is the income that is earned by Americans for working abroad, and that's 816. We call the difference between those two things net income of foreigners, and it's a negative number because the 570 is less than the 817. And finally, if you now add up all those numbers so far, you'll get a number that's not quite equal to 16661 or $16.661 trillion. It's slightly less, and that's because even though conceptually it should be the same as the GDP we estimated from the spending side. And again, that 16.661 trillion is from the spending side calculations we did. This number doesn't quite add up. And so the difference is 163. That's called the statistical discrepancy by economists. It's very small compared to the total, less than 1%. And it shows you how amazingly accurate this other way of computing GDP is, looking at a completely different part of the economy, looking at income rather than at consumption or rather than at spending, and you get a number that's so close. So that's the income side. The third way to think about measuring GDP you might think of it as the most straightforward, conceptually easy to think about, and that's just adding up all the stuff that's produced. You say, hey, if you're interested in measuring production, why didn't you just add up all the steel, all the cars, all the rock crunchers that were produced in the economy? And that makes sense, but you really have to be careful you don't double count. You don't want to both count the steel that comes out of the steel factory and the cars that come out of the automobile factory if a lot of the steel went into making the cars, or if it's aluminum or rubber for the tires, whatever it happens to be. So you have to be very careful when you add up the total production of stuff that's coming out of the factories to only add what's value add the value added at that factory. And that brings us to the concept of value added. Value added, by definition, is the value of production less the value of intermediate goods used in the production. And if you add up only the value added at each stage of production, you're then going to get a measure of GDP. And so that's the trick. If, for example, if it's cars, and you want to measure the amount of cars, but you subtract out the inputs to making the cars, the steel and the rubbers. If you're looking at the steel, you subtract out, say, the iron ore that's going to make into the steel, and you could just consider the value added. So if you just add up all the value added in the economy, you'll get a measure of GDP. A good example of this is drinking espresso at a local store or shopping center. Think about measuring the production of espresso. Well, there's the green beans that have to be grown and harvested. Those green beans are then roasted, but the value added by the roasting is just the difference in the value of the roasted beans less the value of the green beans. And then there's some value added by shipping the beans, the expense that goes into moving and packaging the beans from different places around the world. So the value added of the shipped beans is the difference from what you sell, the production value of the shipped beans less the roasted beans that went into that. And finally, the espresso itself, the beans gets to the store, the people make the espresso, and the value added of the espresso is the difference between the value of the espresso as people purchase it and the value of the shipped beans that went into that. If you add those all together, you get the ideal of not double counting the economy. It's hard to convey how many different products there are and how many inputs in the economy, but sometimes it helps just take a peek of value added by industry. This is an example you can study on your own sometime. It takes the whole U.S. economy and divides it up into different industries and then looks at the value added by each of those industries. So it's not as specific as espresso coffee, not as specific as automobiles. It's much broader categories than that. Nonetheless, you get a feel for what this value added amounts to. For example, the manufacturing value added is 12.5% of GDP. That's a big chunk. Agriculture quite low, 1.2%. Well, one of the biggest items in the table is the finance industry, real estate, and leasing, and that's 20.3% of GDP. It's the biggest chunk of all. Second biggest chunk is government. That's the production of military services or education. And in each of these cases, if you add this together, you'll get the GDP. The sum of all those figures on the right is equal to 100. That is all of GDP. So you get a sense of how this works. It's difficult. This is just a few broad industries. They all can be broken down into much more detail when we compute GDP this way. It's because of the greater complexity of measuring GDP this way that it's done relatively infrequently, maybe every few years rather than every quarter, as the spending approach and the income approach are done. Now finally, there's a very important outcome, if you like, or corollary or byproduct of measuring GDP in these different ways. In particular, if you compare the income and spending approaches, you get kind of an interesting measure of saving for an entire economy. Saving, of course, is the difference between the income, say for an individual or a family, and what that individual or family consumes. The saving is what's left over after consumption. Or you can think about saving for a whole country or for a whole nation in the same way. And in fact, why don't we just define saving as we naturally would do given these ideas and series and concepts we've derived. So saving would be income in the economy, and we think of that as Y, and that's GDP. We've let Y represent GDP. We now know that GDP can be thought of as Consumption is what people spend, households spend. Government is G is what government spends. So you subtract out C and G from Y, and you get a natural definition of saving. We also know that GDP can be computed simply by adding up consumption, investment, net exports, and government purchases, C plus I plus G plus X. So that says there's another way to think about saving, and that is if you subtract C and G from Y in that income identity, you get I plus X, investment plus net exports. So effectively, a country's saving, or its national saving, must equal what it invests plus its net exports. Yet another way to say it is net exports for a country is the difference between its savings and investment. sometimes called the savings investment gap. Net exports, the difference between exports and imports, as we emphasized, another name for that is the trade deficit, difference between what a country is exporting and what it's importing. If the U.S. has a trade deficit, X is negative. If the U.S. has a trade surplus, X is positive. So X is a measure of either surplus or deficit in the trade account. But what this simple idea shows you is that there's a very important relationship between whether a country is running a deficit and what its savings and investment gap is. So, for example, with the U.S. running a trade deficit, X is less than zero, that means that Americans are saving less than they're investing. They're actually getting support from the rest of the world, flow from the rest of the world to support some of its investment in plant, in equipment, trucks and factories, because not saving enough. Another country might have a trade surplus. China has had trade surpluses in recent years, so its net exports is greater than zero. What that tells you right away is that Chinese are saving more than they're investing. So that's the difference, is the amount of the trade surplus from the rest of the world. So by considering the details of how GDP is measured, again, spending, income, and direct measures of production, we not only get a sense of how accurate these numbers are, we get a sense of how the economy works, because it creates these other definitions or corollaries such as saving, which will feed into the theories of what happens to the economy over time. Thank you.